The first Japanese soldier cleared the edge of the cane field at approximately 03:15 hours on the morning of July 7, 1944. He carried a Type 38 rifle with a bayonet fixed to the end. Behind him came another man, then another, then hundreds more, emerging from the darkness in a human wave that seemed to have no end. They were screaming, not the battle cries of men advancing tactically, but something primal, a collective roar that carried across the northern tip of Saipan Island with enough volume to wake sleeping Marines 300 yards away. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, commanding the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment, heard them coming before he saw them. The sound was unlike anything in his combat experience. It wasn't the controlled aggression of soldiers executing a night attack. It was the sound of men who had already decided to die, who were running toward death with the fervor of believers rushing toward salvation. O'Brien grabbed his field telephone and cranked the handle, connecting to regimental headquarters. "They're coming," he said simply. "Hundreds of them, maybe more." What O'Brien couldn't know in that moment, what none of the American defenders positioned along the perimeter could fully grasp, was that they were about to witness the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. Approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians, many armed only with bamboo spears or sharpened sticks, were executing what their commanders called a gyokusai, a shattering of the jewel, a final suicidal assault designed to kill as many Americans as possible before death claimed every attacking Japanese soldier. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese called it an honorable death. The Americans would call it something else entirely, a massacre. But to understand why nearly 2,000 men died in the span of 6 hours, why Japanese commanders ordered an attack they knew would fail, and why American firepower proved so devastatingly effective, we must first understand the doctrine that brought those men to that cane field in the pre-dawn darkness of a July morning. The Banzai Charge was not born from desperation. It was born from belief, from a military culture that had evolved over centuries, from a warrior tradition that valued death over surrender, attack over defense, and spiritual strength over material advantage. The men who ran screaming toward American positions that morning believed they were following a tactical doctrine that had served Japan for generations. They believed their willingness to die would overcome American firepower. They believed, as their officers had told them, that one Japanese soldier fighting with pure spirit was worth 10 Americans fighting for pay. They were catastrophically wrong. But the reason why takes us back years, before Saipan, back to the foundations of Japanese military thinking, back to victories that had convinced an entire army that bayonet charges could defeat machine guns, that fighting spirit could overcome industrial firepower, that death was preferable to the shame of tactical withdrawal. The story of what happened on Saipan begins not with the charge itself, but with the decades of military culture that made such a charge seem not just acceptable, but honorable, even logical. The Japanese army's faith in close combat assault predated the 20th century. The samurai tradition, which had dominated Japanese military culture for 700 years, emphasized individual combat prowess, sword skill, and the willingness to die rather than accept defeat. When Japan modernized its military in the late 1800s, adopting rifles and artillery and modern organizational structures, it retained this psychological core. The new Imperial Japanese Army was equipped with modern weapons, but it was animated by ancient warrior values. The official field manual, the Senjin-kun, or Instructions for the Battlefield, was issued to every Japanese soldier in 1941. The document was explicit about the primacy of spirit over material. Do not think of death as you use up every ounce of your strength to fulfill your duties, it instructed. Make it your joy to do everything with all your spiritual and physical strength. Fear not to die for the cause of everlasting justice. The manual continued. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to avoid the disgrace of being captured alive. This was not mere rhetoric. It was codified doctrine, reinforced through brutal training that emphasized endurance, obedience, and aggression. Japanese infantry training included bayonet drills conducted with religious intensity. Soldiers practiced charging straw dummies while shouting, "A! A!" They were taught that the bayonet was the ultimate weapon, that closing with the enemy in, hand-to-hand combat was the highest form of warfare, that a man willing to die could always defeat a man who wanted to live. The doctrine had historical support. In the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, Japanese infantry had conducted night bayonet charges against Russian positions at Port Arthur and Mukden. The charges had been costly, sometimes devastating, but they had succeeded. Russian troops, facing waves of screaming Japanese soldiers emerging from darkness with fixed bayonets, had often broken and run. The Japanese High Command studied these battles and drew conclusions that would shape their tactics for the next 4 decades. Aggressive night attacks using cold steel could break enemy morale, superior fighting spirit could overcome defensive firepower, and accepting heavy casualties was an acceptable price for victory. These conclusions were reinforced in the 1930s during Japan's war in China. Japanese infantry, often outnumbered by Chinese forces, achieved victories through aggressive tactics and willingness to accept casualties. At Shanghai in 1937, Japanese troops conducted bayonet charges across open ground against Chinese positions. The charges succeeded, not because bayonets were superior weapons, but because Chinese forces were poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and often broke under the psychological pressure of close assault. Japanese commanders noted the victories, but failed to note the specific circumstances that made them possible. They saw confirmation of doctrine, not the weakness of their opponents. The night attack, or yasen, became a cornerstone of Japanese infantry tactics. The reasoning was sound on paper. Darkness negated American advantages in artillery and air support. Close-range fighting reduced the effectiveness of American firepower, and the psychological shock of sudden assault in darkness could break enemy formations before they could organize effective tafar, resistance. Japanese training emphasized night operations. Soldiers practiced moving silently through darkness, navigating by stars and terrain features, coordinating attacks without radio communication, closing to bayonet range before the enemy could react. The early campaigns of the Pacific War seemed to validate everything Japanese doctrine promised. When Japan attacked American, British, and Dutch territories in December 1941, Japanese infantry achieved victories that stunned Western observers. In Malaya, Japanese soldiers moved through jungle that British commanders thought impassable. They conducted night attacks that overwhelmed defensive positions. They infiltrated through rubber plantations in darkness, emerging behind British lines with fixed bayonets. British and Indian troops, trained for conventional European warfare, found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to materialize from nowhere, that attacked at night with fanatical intensity, that never retreated or surrendered. The campaign lasted 70 days. Japanese forces advanced 700 miles down the Malayan Peninsula against numerically superior Commonwealth forces. British commanders, accustomed to set-piece battles with clear front lines, found their formations repeatedly flanked and surrounded by Japanese infantry moving through terrain thought impassable. When Singapore fell on February 15, 1942, 80,000 Commonwealth troops surrendered to a Japanese force of 36,000. It was the largest surrender in British military history. In the Philippines, Japanese infantry employed similar tactics against American and Filipino forces. Night attacks disrupted American defensive positions. Infiltration tactics broke through defensive lines. Japanese soldiers, moving silently through jungle and across rice paddies in darkness, appeared behind American positions before defenders could react. The Bataan Peninsula fell in April 1942. Corregidor, the fortress island guarding Manila Bay, fell in May. 78,000 American and Filipino troops went into captivity. These victories created dangerous assumptions within the Japanese High Command. They assumed their tactics were superior rather than recognizing they had been fighting opponents who were unprepared, poorly positioned, and lacking in jungle warfare experience. They assumed fighting spirit had overcome material disadvantage rather than recognizing they had enjoyed local numerical and air superiority in most engagements. They assumed night attacks and bayonet charges were universally effective, rather than understanding these tactics succeeded against specific opponents under specific circumstances. By mid-1942, Japanese military doctrine had hardened into dogma. Night attacks worked. Bayonet charges broke enemy morale. Fighting spirit overcame firepower. These weren't just tactical principles. They were articles of faith, proven by victory, reinforced through training, embedded in military culture. When Japanese forces began fighting American Marines on Pacific Islands, they brought these assumptions with them. They brought the tactics that had worked in Malaya and the Philippines. They brought the doctrine that emphasized attack over defense, close combat over firepower, death over surrender. What they didn't fully understand was that American Marines were not British colonial troops unprepared for jungle warfare. They were not Filipino units with limited training and obsolete equipment. They were professional infantry with modern weapons, extensive firepower support, and tactical doctrine built around combined arms coordination. The Japanese would learn this lesson on Guadalcanal, on Tarawa, on Peleliu, and on dozens of other islands. But the lesson came slowly, bought with the lives of thousands of Japanese soldiers who charged into American machine guns, believing their fighting spirit would carry them through. By July 1944, when Japanese forces on Saipan prepared their final attack, the pattern had been established across 2 years of island warfare. Japanese night attacks and banzai charges had failed repeatedly against entrenched Marines with adequate firepower. But Japanese commanders, operating under doctrine that had been validated by early victories and reinforced by military culture that valued attack over all else, continued ordering attacks they knew would result in near-total casualties. The charge on Saipan would be the largest, the bloodiest, and perhaps the most futile of them all. The American positions facing the Japanese assault on July 7, 1944, belonged primarily to the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, United States Army. These were not Marines, though Marines held adjacent positions. They were Army infantry, National Guard soldiers from New York, who had been mobilized in October 1940 and had spent nearly 4 years training and fighting across the Pacific. By Saipan, they were veteran troops who understood Japanese tactics and had prepared accordingly. Their defensive line ran roughly east to west across the northern tip of Saipan, anchored on the left by the ocean cliffs and extending inland through cane fields and rough terrain. The line was not continuous in the traditional sense. Instead, it consisted of strong points, mutually supporting positions built around crew-served weapons with riflemen filling the gaps between. Each strongpoint was sited to provide overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any approach to the line would be covered by multiple weapons. The primary defensive weapon was the Browning M1919A 430 caliber machine gun. Each infantry company had 6 of these weapons, belt-fed air-cooled machine guns capable of firing up to 500 rounds per minute, with effective range exceeding 1,000 yards. The guns were positioned on tripods with traverse and elevation mechanisms that allowed precise fire control. Ammunition was stored in metal cans, each containing 250 rounds linked into belts. A trained crew could change barrels in seconds when overheating threatened, maintaining sustained fire indefinitely as long as ammunition lasted. Heavier firepower came from Browning M250 caliber machine guns, the same weapons that had proven so effective against Japanese tanks. These guns, firing at 450 to 600 rounds per minute, could engage targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The 50 caliber rounds, each weighing over 4 ounces, could tear through vegetation, penetrate light cover, and inflict devastating wounds on human targets. The guns were positioned at key points along the defensive line, sighted to cover likely avenues of approach and provide long-range interdiction fire. Artillery support came from multiple sources. The 105th Infantry's own weapons company operated 81mm mortars, medium indirect fire weapons that could drop high explosive shells onto targets up to 3,000 yards away. Each shell contained approximately 3 pounds of explosive, sufficient to kill or wound anyone within a 30-foot radius of impact. The mortars were pre-registered on likely assembly areas and approach routes, allowing crews to begin firing within seconds of receiving fire missions. Heavier support came from the attached field artillery battalions. The 121st Field Artillery Battalion operated 12 M2A1 105mm howitzers, weapons capable of firing 33-pound high-explosive shells to ranges exceeding 12,000 yards. These guns were positioned several miles behind the front line, protected but close enough to provide responsive fire support. Forward observers with the infantry companies could call for fire missions using radio or field telephone, bringing artillery shells onto targets within minutes. The defenders also had access to naval gunfire support. Offshore, destroyers and cruisers stood ready to fire their main batteries in support of ground forces. A single 5-inch naval gun could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute, each shell containing 7 pounds of high explosive. Larger cruiser guns, 6-inch and 8-inch weapons, fired shells weighing over 100 pounds with devastating explosive power. Fire support ships maintained radio contact with shore fire control parties who could direct naval gunfire onto targets visible from the front lines. The Americans had one more critical advantage: illumination. Artillery units had shells filled with magnesium flares suspended beneath parachutes. When fired, these shells would burst at predetermined altitudes, igniting flares that would drift slowly earthward while burning at extraordinary intensity, turning night into harsh, artificial daylight for minutes at a time. The illumination shells allowed defenders to see attacking forces clearly, negating the Japanese tactical advantage of darkness, transforming a night attack into a shooting gallery where every attacker was visible while defenders remained hidden in their prepared positions. The defensive positions themselves reflected lessons learned through 2 years of fighting Japanese infantry. Foxholes were deep, providing protection from shell fragments and small arms fire. Machine gun positions had overhead cover against mortar fire and were sighted in depth so that even if forward positions were overrun, rear positions could continue firing. Communications, trenches connected positions, allowing movement between strong points without exposure to fire. Ammunition was stockpiled in quantities that would have seemed impossible in earlier campaigns. Each machine gun position had thousands of rounds immediately available, with more stored nearby. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien had perhaps 15 minutes between the first sighting reports and the moment the Japanese assault hit his battalion's positions. He used the time efficiently. Artillery forward observers called for illumination rounds. Within minutes, the first shells burst overhead, igniting flares that revealed the full scope of what was approaching. What the defenders saw was beyond anything they had anticipated. The Japanese were not advancing in organized tactical formations. They were running in a mass, thousands of men packed so tightly that individuals were indistinguishable in the crowd. The front ranks carried rifles with fixed bayonets. Behind them came men with swords, officers waving katanas overhead. Behind them came men with bamboo spears, sharpened poles that could serve as makeshift weapons in close combat. Some carried satchel charges, explosive packs that could be thrown into American positions. Many were wounded already, bandaged soldiers from the field hospital who had been sent into the attack because every able body was needed. Some were civilians, armed with whatever implements they could find, driven forward by desperation or fanaticism or simple resignation to death. The sound was overwhelming. 4,000 voices screaming, "Banzai! Banzai!" In unison, the word meaning 10,000 years, a traditional expression of loyalty to the emperor, now transformed into a battle cry that seemed to embody everything about Japanese military culture, loyalty, aggression, acceptance of death. The roar was continuous, rising and falling as different groups of attackers surged forward, but never stopping, a wall of sound that preceded the human wave by seconds. American machine gunners opened fire at approximately 400 yards, the maximum effective range where they could reasonably expect to hit individual targets under artificial illumination. The 30 caliber guns fired in sustained bursts, 5 to 7 round bursts delivered with practiced precision. Tracers marked the trajectory of fire, every fifth round burning bright red as it flew down range, allowing gunners to see exactly where their fire was going and adjust accordingly. The sound of multiple machine guns firing simultaneously created a distinctive roar, a continuous tearing noise that drowned out individual shots. The effect on the packed Japanese formation was immediate and catastrophic. Men in the front ranks fell in groups, cut down by machine gun fire that was striking multiple targets with every burst. The attackers behind them stumbled over bodies or were hit themselves by fire that continued without pause. The Japanese did not slow. They could not slow. The mass of men behind continued pushing forward, creating a horrific momentum, where forward movement was mandated not by tactical necessity, but by physical pressure from thousands of men moving in the same direction. Artillery fire began falling within 90 seconds of the initial contact. Forward observers called for missions on pre-registered coordinates, target points that had been surveyed and recorded days earlier. The 105mm howitzers fired in battery volleys, 4 guns firing simultaneously, sending shells arcing overhead to impact in the cane fields where Japanese forces were massing for the attack. Each shell created a burst of flame and shrapnel, a cloud of steel fragments moving at supersonic velocity that could wound or kill anyone within 30 yards of the impact point. The Japanese charge continued. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds, but the attack did not stop. Japanese officers, easily identifiable by their swords and by their positions at the front of the assault, were priority targets for American riflemen. M1 Garand rifles, semi-automatic weapons capable of firing 8 rounds as fast as a rifleman could pull the trigger, picked off officers and NCOs with methodical precision. Each officer who fell created a leadership vacuum, but the charge continued anyway, driven forward by momentum, and by the cultural imperatives that made retreat unthinkable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 200 yards, the 50 caliber machine guns began sustained fire. These weapons, positioned to fire grazing fire across the approaches to American positions, delivered devastating firepower. The heavy bullets struck with enough energy to dismember human bodies, to tear through multiple targets in a single shot when men were packed densely enough. The gunners fired in longer bursts than the 30 caliber crews, 10 to 15 round bursts, sweeping the guns from side to side to cover the width of the attacking formation. Barrel changes became necessary every few minutes as the weapons heated from sustained firing, but ammunition was abundant, and crews had trained for this exact scenario. The closest Japanese soldiers reached to American lines was approximately 25 yards at one point where the defensive line curved around a small depression in the terrain. A group of perhaps 30 attackers, moving through dead ground that provided temporary concealment from direct fire, emerged suddenly near a machine gun position manned by Private First Class John Domanowski and his assistant gunner. Domanowski's gun had just undergone a barrel change and was temporarily out of action. The Japanese, seeing the opportunity, charged the final distance with bayonets leveled. Domanowski grabbed his M1 carbine and fired point-blank into the approaching soldiers. His assistant gunner fired his own carbine while simultaneously working to mount the new barrel. Riflemen in adjacent positions shifted fire to support the threatened gun position. The Japanese soldiers fell within feet of the American foxhole, their momentum carrying them forward even as bullets struck home. One Japanese soldier, already mortally wounded, managed to lunge forward with his bayonet, striking Domanowski in the shoulder before collapsing. It was the only American casualty at that particular position, bought at the cost of 30 Japanese lives. This pattern repeated across the defensive line throughout the night and into the morning hours. Japanese forces would mass in the cane fields or in ravines, attempting to find covered approaches to American positions. Illumination rounds would expose them. Artillery and mortar fire would fall on the assembly areas. Survivors would charge forward anyway, running into machine gun fire that cut them down in windows. Small groups would occasionally penetrate to close range, only to be killed by rifle fire or grenades before they could inflict significant casualties. The Japanese attack was not a single wave, but rather a series of assaults that continued through the night. As forward groups were destroyed, commanders in the rear would organize new attacks using whatever forces remained. Some attacks were relatively organized, with officers attempting to coordinate movement and concentrate forces at weak points. Others were simply desperate rushes by groups of soldiers who knew they were going to die and wanted to kill Americans before death found them. American ammunition consumption was extraordinary. Machine gun crews fired thousands of rounds per gun, changing barrels multiple times as weapons overheated from sustained use. The 30 caliber guns, each with a basic load of 3,000 rounds, exhausted their initial ammunition supplies and required resupply from battalion stocks. Riflemen armed with M1 Garands went through hundreds of rounds each, far exceeding normal combat consumption rates. Artillery batteries fired mission after mission, expending shells at rates that would have been unsustainable in earlier campaigns, but were easily supported by the logistical apparatus that now supported American forces in the Pacific. The naval guns offshore added their firepower to the defensive fires. 5-inch guns from destroyers fired illumination rounds to supplement Army artillery, maintaining constant artificial daylight over the battlefield. When Japanese forces attempted to mass in areas beyond the range of Army mortars, naval gunfire was directed onto those positions, 6-inch and 8-inch shells, creating massive explosions that could be felt by American defenders hundreds of yards away. By 0600 hours, as natural dawn light began illuminating the battlefield, the intensity of Japanese attacks had diminished noticeably. The charges continued, but they were smaller now, groups of 50 or 100 men rather than waves of thousands. The cane fields between the Japanese start line and American positions were carpeted with bodies. So many dead that walking between them without stepping on human remains was impossible. Some wounded Japanese soldiers, unable to continue the attack but unwilling or unable to retreat, remained in place among the dead, occasionally firing rifles at American positions or calling for help that would not come. The final significant attack came at approximately 0800 hours. A group of perhaps 200 Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded, conducted what amounted to a walking advance toward American positions. They were not running. They were not screaming. They were simply walking forward with weapons held ready, advancing at a steady pace toward defensive positions they could see clearly in full daylight. American machine gunners, who had been firing for 5 hours with only brief pauses, opened fire again. The Japanese soldiers fell in neat rows, cut down by fire from multiple weapons. Not one reached the American defensive line. The attack ended not with dramatic last stands, but with the simple cessation of movement as the last attackers fell. When American patrols moved forward at 0930 hours on July 7, 1944, they entered a landscape transformed by 6 hours of industrial violence. The cane fields that had provided concealment for the Japanese approach were trampled flat, the vegetation shredded by machine gun fire and shell fragments. The ground itself seemed to have been ploughed by the weight of explosives, churned into a moonscape of overlapping shell craters, each depression filled with muddy water mixed with blood. The bodies lay in patterns that told the story of the battle more clearly than any after-action report. Near the Japanese start line, approximately 800 yards from American positions, the dead were scattered in loose groups, men who had been hit by artillery fire as they assembled for the attack, or who had fallen to long-range machine gun fire in the initial minutes of the assault. Closer to American lines, the density increased. At 400 yards, bodies lay in windows, stacked upon each other where multiple men had fallen in the same machine gun-beaten zone. At 200 yards, the carnage was beyond description. Bodies were piled 3 and 4 deep in some places, the dead lying in positions that suggested they had been running at full speed when bullets struck them down. The official count, compiled over 2 days as graves registration teams worked through the battlefield, recorded 1,942 Japanese dead. The actual number was certainly higher. Bodies in shell craters filled with water were not always found immediately. Some wounded Japanese soldiers crawled into the remaining cane fields or into ravines and died there, their bodies discovered weeks later. Some were so thoroughly dismembered by artillery fire that counting individual casualties became impossible, and estimates had to suffice. American casualties from the Banzai charge itself numbered 106 killed and 245 wounded. These figures, while significant, represented less than 6% of the casualties inflicted on the attackers. The exchange ratio, nearly 20 Japanese dead for every American killed, was among the most lopsided of the Pacific War. But the numbers alone did not capture the full reality of what had occurred. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, who had commanded the 1st Battalion through the night battle, was among the American dead. He had been killed not during the main assault but in the final hours of fighting, shot by a Japanese soldier who had infiltrated close to battalion headquarters. O'Brien had received the Medal of Honor posthumously, the citation noting his leadership in organizing the defense that had destroyed the Japanese attack. His death illustrated an important truth about the Banzai charge. Even in catastrophic defeat, even when an attack failed to achieve any tactical objective, Japanese soldiers could still inflict casualties through individual acts of desperate courage. The Japanese survivors, those who had not participated in the charge or who had somehow survived wounds that should have been fatal, faced psychological devastation that transcended physical injury. Corporal Kiyoshi Ogawa, captured by Marines on July 9th after being found hiding in a cave with untreated bullet wounds to his leg and abdomen, told his interrogators that he had watched the entire charge from a position on the flank. He had been assigned as a runner to the regimental commander and had witnessed the attack unfold from beginning to end. Ogawa's account, preserved in intelligence reports and later in historical archives, provided rare insight into Japanese perceptions of the disaster. He described how regimental officers had briefed the assembled troops before the attack, telling them that American forces were exhausted and demoralized, that one more determined assault would break the American line, that death in service to the Emperor was the highest honor a soldier could achieve. The officers had not lied about the near certainty of death, but they had lied about everything else. American forces were not exhausted. The line did not break. The attack achieved nothing except the destruction of the attacking force. Ogawa reported that he had believed the officers completely before the attack began. He had believed that Japanese fighting spirit would overcome American material advantages. He had believed that bayonet charges could defeat machine guns if the attackers were willing to die. He had believed these things because his entire military training had reinforced them, because earlier victories in China had seemed to prove them, because the alternative, accepting that Japanese tactics were fundamentally flawed, was unthinkable within the context of military culture that defined his existence. Watching the charge collapse under American firepower had destroyed these beliefs instantly and completely. Ogawa described watching men disappear in groups as artillery shells landed among them. He described seeing entire ranks of soldiers fall simultaneously when machine gun fire swept across the formation. He described the desperate futility of men charging toward positions that were simply annihilating them with industrial efficiency, like workers at a factory processing raw materials into finished products, except the product was corpses. The Banzai charge on Saipan was not an isolated incident, but rather the largest and most visible example of a tactical approach that had failed repeatedly throughout the Pacific War. On Guadalcanal in October 1942, Japanese forces had conducted night attacks against Marine positions along the Matanikau River. The attacks had been repulsed with heavy Japanese casualties and minimal American losses. On Tarawa in November 1943, Japanese defenders had launched counterattacks against Marine beachheads, achieving nothing except adding to their own casualty counts. On Kwajalein in February 1944, similar attacks had similar results. Each failure had been explained. away by Japanese commanders as resulting from specific local factors rather than fundamental tactical flaws. The troops had not attacked with sufficient spirit. The Americans had been lucky. Coordination had been imperfect. The underlying doctrine was never questioned, because questioning doctrine meant questioning the entire structure of military culture that defined the Imperial Japanese Army. To admit that Banzai charges were suicide rather than tactics, that fighting spirit could not overcome firepower, that death in futile attacks was waste rather than honor, would require dismantling beliefs that held the military together. American commanders, by contrast, had learned clear lessons from each engagement with Japanese forces. Night attacks could be defeated through illumination and prepared defensive positions. Banzai charges could be stopped through concentration of automatic weapons fire and pre-registered artillery. Japanese tactics, once understood, were predictable and could be countered methodically. The challenge was not defeating the attacks, but maintaining the firepower and ammunition supplies necessary to do so consistently. The industrial disparity that made this possible was extraordinary. American factories were producing machine gun ammunition at rates exceeding 1 billion rounds per month by mid-1944. Artillery shell production exceeded 2 million rounds monthly for 105mm howitzers alone. The logistical network that delivered these supplies to Pacific Islands involved thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of support personnel, and coordination across distances that would have been unimaginable in earlier wars. A single American infantry battalion on Saipan expended more ammunition in one night of defensive fighting than some nations produced in entire wars. Japanese industry, strangled by submarine warfare that had reduced merchant shipping to a fraction of pre-war levels, could not begin to match this. Production. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific were often reduced to carefully husbanding ammunition, firing rifles sparingly, avoiding prolonged engagements because replacement ammunition might not arrive for weeks or months. The contrast between American abundance and Japanese scarcity was visible in every battle, evident in every engagement where American forces could afford to saturate target areas with fire, while Japanese forces had to carefully select targets and limit expenditure. The Saipan Banzai charge represented the collision of these two realities in its starkest form. Japanese commanders, operating under doctrine that emphasized attack and accepted massive casualties as normal, ordered an assault that consumed virtually every remaining combat-effective soldier on the northern portion of the island. American commanders, with access to virtually unlimited firepower and ammunition, organized a defense that methodically destroyed the attacking force with minimal friendly casualties. The outcome was predetermined not by courage or leadership or tactical skill, though all these factors mattered, but by the fundamental industrial and material disparities between the two nations. Japanese military culture had prepared soldiers to die, but not to fight effectively in modern industrial warfare. American military culture, with its emphasis on firepower, combined arms coordination, and logistics, had created an approach to warfare that treated battles as problems to be solved through application of overwhelming material resources. The two approaches had collided repeatedly across 2 years of Pacific fighting. Saipan was simply the largest and clearest example of what happened when they met. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese forces across the Pacific was profound. Word of the Saipan disaster spread through military channels despite efforts to suppress it. Japanese soldiers on other islands heard what had happened. They knew that 4,000 men had attacked, and fewer than 100 had survived. They knew that American firepower had simply annihilated the attacking force. They knew that similar attacks on other islands had similar results. And they knew that Japanese doctrine would continue demanding such attacks regardless of outcomes, because admitting failure would require admitting that the entire basis of Japanese military culture was flawed. The Banzai charge, as a deliberate tactical choice, effectively ended at Saipan, though Japanese commanders would never formally acknowledge this. On subsequent islands, Japanese defensive tactics shifted toward static defense, toward fighting from caves and fortifications, toward forcing Americans to dig them out position by position, rather than exposing themselves in suicidal charges that accomplished nothing except generating casualty statistics. The shift was pragmatic rather than doctrinal. Commanders recognized that they could inflict more American casualties and delay American advances longer by defending in place rather than attacking. Iwo Jima in February 1945 represented the fullest expression of this new approach. Japanese forces under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi constructed elaborate defensive positions in caves and tunnels, established interlocking fields of fire, and fought from prepared positions rather than launching counterattacks. The battle lasted 36 days and cost the lives of nearly 7,000 Americans, far more than had died on Saipan. But 21,000 Japanese defenders also died, and they died defending positions that at least allowed them to inflict casualties in exchange for their own deaths, rather than simply dying in futile charges across open ground. Okinawa in April through June 1945 saw similar defensive tactics. Japanese forces fought from caves and fortified positions, conducting limited counterattacks but never committing to large-scale banzai charges of the type seen on Saipan. The battle lasted 82 days and cost 12,000 American lives, the highest toll of any Pacific battle. But it also cost over 100,000 Japanese military lives, and the casualty ratio, while more favorable to the Japanese than at Saipan, still represented unsustainable losses that could not be replaced. The survivors of Saipan's banzai charge, the few dozen men who had participated and lived, carried their experience for the rest of their lives. Corporal Ogawa, who survived his wounds and American captivity to return to Japan after the war, rarely spoke about his experiences. When he did, in interviews conducted decades later by historians, he described the charge with a flat, affectless tone that suggested trauma never fully processed. He talked about believing his officers before the attack and disbelieving everything afterward. He talked about watching friends die in windows, falling so fast that their deaths seemed unreal, like images from a film, rather than actual events. Most significantly, Ogawa talked about the moment when he understood that everything he had been taught was a lie. Not a misunderstanding or an error in judgment, but a deliberate lie constructed to motivate soldiers to die in attacks that commanders knew were futile. The officers who had briefed the troops before the charge had known the Americans were not exhausted or demoralized. They had known the attack would fail. They had ordered it anyway because Japanese military culture valued the appearance of aggressive action over the reality of tactical effectiveness, because dying in attack was considered more honorable than dying in defense, because admitting that banzai charges were obsolete would require admitting that much of Japanese military doctrine was obsolete. For American veterans of Saipan, the memory of that night stayed with them as well, though in different ways. Machine gunners remembered the physical sensation of sustained fire, the weight of the gun jumping against their shoulders with each burst, the heat radiating from barrels that glowed red in darkness, the mechanical rhythm of firing and reloading that continued until muscles functioned from memory rather than conscious thought. They remembered the sound, the continuous roar of weapons fire that left ears ringing for days afterward, and they remembered the sight visible when morning light finally revealed the full extent of the carnage. Private Harold Johnson, who had manned a .30 caliber machine gun through the entire night battle, told interviewers 50 years later that he had fired approximately 6,000 rounds during those 6 hours. He remembered the number precisely because counting ammunition cans had been his way of processing what was happening, a mechanical task that allowed his mind to function while participating in mass killing. He remembered that his gun crew had gone through 3 barrel changes. He remembered that his assistant gunner had needed to be relieved after 2 hours because the stress of continuous action had caused him to vomit repeatedly while still feeding ammunition belts into the gun. Most of all, Johnson remembered walking across the battlefield after the fighting stopped and understanding that he had personally killed dozens of men, perhaps more than 100, during that night. The mathematics were simple. 6,000 rounds fired, typical machine gun accuracy against massed targets at close range, multiple hits often required to incapacitate a single target. The number was large enough to be abstract, impossible to truly comprehend as representing individual human deaths. Yet each body on the battlefield had been a person, someone who had believed his officers when they promised that attack would succeed, someone who had run screaming toward American positions, thinking courage and fighting spirit would somehow overcome industrial firepower. The irony that had opened this story that Japanese commanders thought 2,000 attacking troops would break through American lines, when in fact nearly 2,000 would die without breaking anything, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of modern warfare. Japanese doctrine, rooted in 19th century experience and early 20th century victories against weak opponents, had never fully adapted to the reality of industrial warfare, where material resources mattered more than fighting spirit. American doctrine, developed through hard experience in 2 world wars and refined through industrial mobilization that exceeded anything previously attempted in human history, had created a way of war that treated battles as engineering problems to be solved through application of resources. When these 2 doctrines collided on Saipan in the pre-dawn darkness of July 7, 1944, the outcome was never in doubt. 4,000 Japanese soldiers charged into prepared defensive positions manned by troops, with adequate ammunition and overwhelming firepower support. In 6 hours, nearly 2,000 Japanese died. The attack failed completely, achieving no tactical objective, breaking no defensive positions, accomplishing nothing except creating a casualty count that would stand as testament to the futility of tactics divorced from material reality. The men who ran screaming into American machine guns that night died believing they were following honored tradition, executing proven tactics, serving their emperor with the highest form of martial devotion. They were wrong. But the lie that killed them had been told by their commanders, reinforced by their culture, and validated by victories won against opponents who lacked the resources to resist effectively. When they finally faced an opponent with industrial capacity to sustain defensive firepower indefinitely, the lie was exposed. The revelation came too late for the nearly 2,000 who died, too late for the survivors who carried trauma for the rest of their lives, too late to change a war whose outcome had already been determined by factory production rates and logistical capacity as much as by battlefield courage. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.